The evening felt different, almost perfect, as I quietly unlocked the door to our home. I balanced a brown paper bag in one hand, the bottle of Merlot in the other, and for the first time in weeks, I felt truly present. The day had been uncharacteristically productive. The parent-teacher conference at the high school wrapped up ahead of schedule, and I decided to make the most of the extra time. Sophia had been working tirelessly these past months. Her career in advertising demanded long hours, and the mounting pressure was evident in her weary eyes and hurried movements. We both deserved a moment of reprieve, and tonight, I was determined to give her just that. I stepped inside, the familiar scent of our home wrapping around me like a warm blanket. The faint creak of the wooden floorboards beneath my feet seemed louder in the stillness of the house. The silence was unexpected. Normally, Sophia would have her favorite playlist on, a mix of upbeat tunes and podcasts about urban legends. Our home was rarely quiet. That was one of the things I loved about her. She brought life to every corner of our space. But tonight, it was eerily calm. Setting the bag on the kitchen counter, I glanced around. The kitchen was immaculate, the counters gleaming as if they hadn't been touched all day. That was unusual for Sophia. She wasn't messy by any stretch, but there was always something, a half-empty mug of tea or a plate left out from breakfast. Tonight, though, everything seemed staged. "Sophia?" I called softly, not wanting to shatter the fragile quiet. No response. My voice felt out of place, almost intrusive. I reached for my phone, hesitating for a moment before deciding not to text her. She had to be home. Her car was in the driveway. The hallway leading to the stairs felt longer than usual, the framed photos on the walls catching my eye. There we were, frozen in time. Smiling on a beach in Maui, arms wrapped around each other during a family Christmas, her laughter lighting up the frame from our anniversary dinner last year. It was a life filled with moments of joy, yet tonight those smiles felt distant. I climbed the stairs, each step deliberate, my senses heightened in the stillness. A faint glow caught my attention, spilling out from the crack of our bedroom door. I stopped mid-step, my heart skipping a beat. The light was on, a detail so mundane yet suddenly ominous in the silence. I wasn't sure what I expected to find, but the unusual quiet, the spotless kitchen, and now this light. It all felt slightly off. Before I reached the door, I paused, gripping the bottle of wine tighter. Maybe she'd fallen asleep with the light on. Maybe she was scrolling through her phone, decompressing from her day. Maybe I was overthinking things. But as I stood there, the faintest sound drifted through the door, a laugh. Sophia's laugh. But it wasn't the laugh I knew. It wasn't the hearty, unrestrained laugh that came when I told her one of my terrible jokes or when she caught up with her sister over the phone. This laugh was different. Lighter, softer, almost playful, flirtatious. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. My thoughts raced, trying to piece together the incongruence of the moment. Who was she talking to? And why was she laughing like that? My fingers itched to push the door open, but I stopped myself. Instead, I shifted slightly, peering through the narrow gap. And there she was, lounging on the bed, her legs stretched out casually, her back propped up against the pillows. She was wearing the lavender robe I'd given her on our 5th anniversary, the fabric slipping slightly off her shoulder. It framed her perfectly, too perfectly. Her phone was balanced on a pillow in front of her, the camera angled toward her face. She hadn't noticed me yet, her focus entirely on the screen. Her voice was low and smooth as she spoke. "This weekend, of course. I'd love that." I clenched the bottle tighter, the chilled glass biting into my palm. My chest tightened, my thoughts a jumble of confusion and dread. Something was very, very wrong. I stood there, frozen, caught in a moment that felt surreal. The faint glow from the bedroom spilled out into the dark hallway, cutting a line of light across my feet. I could hear her voice, soft, warm, and unfamiliar in its tone. There was something so profoundly wrong about it. Sophia's laugh wasn't meant to sound like that, not for anyone but me. And yet here she was, on the other side of the door, giving that laugh to someone else. I leaned closer to the narrow gap, my breathing shallow as if I feared making any sound. The angle was perfect enough to catch a glimpse of the screen on her phone, though I couldn't see the man's face. His voice, deep and casual, carried through the speaker, his words indistinct but intimate. My pulse roared in my ears as the scene before me played out like a cruel movie I didn't remember signing up for. Sophia adjusted herself on the bed, her movements languid, unguarded. She tugged the edge of her lavender robe over her shoulder, a small, meaningless gesture that somehow felt deliberate. Staged. My mind raced, grasping at explanations, even as my gut churned with the truth that I was already beginning to understand. "This weekend, of course," she said, her voice playful, with that tone of promise I hadn't heard in so long. "I'd love that." The words hit me like a slap. My grip tightened on the bottle of wine, its cold surface grounding me against the whirlwind of thoughts that threatened to consume me. Who was she talking to? What weekend? What this? "See you soon, babe," the man said, his voice breaking through the haze in my mind like a crack of thunder. Babe, babe. That single word crystallized the truth in a way I couldn't ignore. My stomach turned, my chest tightening as if the air had been sucked out of the room. This wasn't a work call or a harmless chat with a friend. It wasn't innocent. I didn't mean to move, but my foot shifted, nudging the door just enough to make it creak. The sound was small, but it might as well have been an explosion. Sophia's head snapped up, her expression shifting in an instant from relaxed to panicked. Her eyes locked onto mine, wide and full of something between guilt and fear. She scrambled to grab her phone, her fingers fumbling as she swiped at the screen, ending the call. "Caleb," she stammered, her voice trembling as she clutched the phone to her chest like a lifeline. She looked as though she'd been caught in the middle of a crime, because she had. I said nothing. I couldn't. The words I wanted to say were tangled in my throat, blocked by the sheer weight of what I had just witnessed. Instead, I stepped fully into the room, leaning against the doorframe. I crossed my arms, letting the silence stretch between us. The weight of my presence was enough to pin her to the bed, her guilt palpable in the charged air. "Caleb, I can explain," she began, her voice shaky but edged with something else, defensiveness. I raised an eyebrow, keeping my tone deliberately calm despite the anger bubbling beneath the surface. "Oh, please do. Explain. Enlighten me." She faltered, her gaze darting from me to the phone in her hands. "It's not what you think," she said hastily, the cliché hanging hollow in the suffocating silence. "Not what I think," I repeated, my voice low, steady, though every muscle in my body was tense. "You were lying in our bed, calling another man babe, and making plans for the weekend. So, please, Sophia, tell me, what exactly am I supposed to think?" Her face paled. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Finally, she muttered, "He's just a friend." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. A friend? Since when do friends get to hear that laugh? I gestured toward her, my voice rising slightly. "Since when do you wear that robe for a friend while lounging on our bed?" Her jaw tightened, and something flickered in her expression. Defiance, maybe desperation. "You don't understand," she muttered. "You're right. I don't understand," I snapped, my calm facade cracking. "So why don't you help me out?" She sat up straighter, drawing in a shaky breath. "Caleb, you've been so distant lately," she said, her voice trembling. "You're always at work, always tired when you're home. I've been feeling invisible." The word hit me like a punch to the gut. Invisible? The woman sitting in front of me, the same woman I had been planning a surprise dinner for, was telling me she felt invisible? And her solution to that was this? "Invisible," I repeated, my voice heavy with disbelief. "So your answer was to go behind my back? To invite another man into your life?" "It wasn't like that," she shot back, her voice rising. "It started as nothing. Just someone to talk to. Someone who noticed me." Her words hit me harder than I expected, but I swallowed the lump in my throat and let the silence speak for me. Her excuses hung in the air like smoke. Thin, toxic, impossible to ignore. "What is it now, Sophia?" I finally asked, my voice cold. "Because it doesn't look like just talking anymore." Her gaze dropped to the phone in her hands. Her fingers tightened around it, her knuckles white. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice small. I don't know what it is anymore. It was a moment I'll never forget. Standing there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, I realized just how fragile everything we had built truly was. I walked out of the bedroom without another word, my footsteps heavy against the hardwood floor as I descended the stairs. Each step felt like it carried a weight I couldn't shed. My mind raced, but I couldn't think clearly. I couldn't even look at her anymore. The image of her lounging on our bed, wearing that robe, laughing for someone else, replayed in my mind like a broken record. The paper bag with her favorite dinner and the bottle of wine were still sitting on the kitchen counter, untouched. A cruel reminder of what I thought tonight would be, a quiet evening together, a brief escape from the chaos of our lives. Now, the sight of it felt like a mockery of my intentions. I grabbed my car keys, ignoring the faint sound of Sophia calling after me. "Caleb, please, don't leave like this. We need to talk." Her voice trembled, but I didn't stop. The sound of her footsteps on the stairs was followed by a louder, more desperate plea, "Caleb, wait." I didn't turn around. I didn't respond. I just opened the front door and walked out, letting it close behind me with a muted thud. The crisp night air hit me, sharp and cold, a contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from my chest, and my hands were trembling as I started the car. I didn't have a plan. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that I couldn't stay there, not after what I'd seen and heard. The betrayal was too fresh, the anger and confusion too overwhelming. I drove aimlessly through the streets of Portland, the city lights blurring as tears stung my eyes. I hadn't cried in years, but now the tears came, unbidden and relentless. Eventually, I found myself parked outside Marcus's house. I hadn't even realized where I was going until I saw his porch light glowing faintly. Marcus had been my best friend since college, steadfast, loyal, and always the first person I turned to in times of crisis. Tonight was no exception. I sat in the car for a moment, gripping the steering wheel as I tried to collect myself. But the more I tried to calm down, the more the rage and hurt bubbled to the surface. Finally, I stepped out and walked to the door. I knocked softly, and within seconds, Marcus opened it. His expression shifted immediately from curiosity to concern as he took in my appearance. "Caleb?" he asked, stepping aside to let me in. "What's going on? You look like you've seen a ghost." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I walked past him into the living room and sank onto the couch. His dog, a sleepy golden retriever named Max, lifted his head briefly before settling back down on the rug. The normalcy of it, the quiet hum of a life uninterrupted, felt like a punch to the gut. Marcus sat across from me, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. "Talk to me," he said gently, and so I did. I told him everything, from the moment I walked into the house to the moment I left. The words spilled out of me like a flood, raw and jagged, each one cutting deeper than the last. I told him about the laugh, the call, the way she'd looked in that robe. I told him about the excuses she gave, the way she'd said she felt invisible. By the time I finished, my throat was dry, and my hands were shaking again. Marcus listened quietly, his jaw tightening as I spoke. When I finally stopped, he let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "Man," he said, his voice low, "I don't even know what to say." "There's nothing to say," I replied, slumping further into the couch. "I don't even know what to do." He sat back, his eyes narrowing in thought. "What do you want to do? Because whatever it is, Caleb, you need to be clear about it. You can't let her twist this into something it's not." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I entirely understood what I wanted. Confrontation? Answers? Closure? None of it seemed within reach at the moment. All I knew was that I felt shattered, like the foundation of my life had been ripped out from under me. "You need to confront her," Marcus said firmly, his tone sharpening. "But not tonight. Take the night to calm down. Think it through. Don't let her manipulate you into thinking this is your fault." I looked at him, grateful for his unwavering clarity. "Yeah," I said quietly, though the thought of facing Sophia again filled me with a sense of dread. "You're right. I need the truth. All of it." "Good," he said, nodding. "But Caleb, don't go into this thinking you're going to fix it. Go into it knowing you deserve to know the truth, no matter how ugly it is. The words hit me harder than I expected. Deserve. It had been so long since I thought about what I deserved. I stayed at Marcus's house that night, unable to face the thought of going back home. As I lay awake on his couch, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder how things had gone so wrong. Sophia's words echoed in my mind, her voice trembling with that one word, invisible. Invisible. The irony was unbearable. In that moment, it felt like I was the one who had disappeared. The next morning, I woke up to the faint aroma of coffee drifting through Marcus's living room. My back ached from the couch, and my mind was already swirling before I even opened my eyes. The events of the previous night came rushing back in vivid, painful detail. I sat up slowly, running a hand through my hair as the weight of what I had to do pressed heavily on my chest. Marcus handed me a mug of coffee when I walked into the kitchen. He didn't say much, just a nod that told me he was there if I needed him. I appreciated that. No forced pep talks or empty reassurances, just a quiet acknowledgement of the storm I was about to face. I thanked him, finished my coffee in silence, and drove back to the house. The closer I got, the more my stomach churned. The house looked the same as it always did, but it felt different now. It wasn't home anymore. It was the scene of a crime, a place where trust had been shattered. I hesitated at the door, my hand hovering over the handle before I finally forced myself inside. Sophia was in the kitchen when I walked in, stirring a cup of coffee as if nothing had happened. She looked up when she saw me, her expression unreadable. There was no music playing, no usual background hum of life in the house. Just silence. It felt heavy, almost oppressive, as I leaned against the counter and crossed my arms. "Can we talk?" she asked softly, setting the mug down. Her voice was steady, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands fidgeted at her sides. "That depends," I said, my tone sharp. "Are you actually going to tell me the truth this time?" Her cheeks flushed, and she looked away for a moment before meeting my eyes. "I've told you everything," she said quietly. "It's not what you're making it out to be." "Stop lying to me, Sophia," I said, my voice firm. "I deserve better than that. If you can't be honest, then there's nothing left to say." For a moment, she said nothing. Her gaze dropped to the floor, and the seconds stretched out painfully. Finally, she let out a shaky breath and looked up at me, her eyes brimming with tears. "You're right," she whispered. "I haven't told you everything." The words hit me like a punch to the gut, even though I'd already suspected as much. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay calm. "Then start talking." She gripped the edge of the counter, as if it might keep her grounded, and began to speak. "It started months ago," she admitted, her voice trembling, "at a conference in Seattle. It was one of those networking events, and I met him there." "Seattle?" I interrupted, my mind racing. "The weekend you said you were working late on a client pitch?" She nodded, guilt flashing across her face. "I didn't tell you because I knew you'd overthink it. At the time, it wasn't a big deal. We talked a bit. He was charming, easy to talk to. It felt harmless." I folded my arms tighter, trying to keep my composure. "And then?" "At first, it really was just talking," she said, her words coming faster now. "We exchanged numbers, and we'd text occasionally. It felt good to have someone notice me, to feel seen." The word stung sharper than I expected. Seen. As if I hadn't been trying all these years to make her feel exactly that. "When did it stop being innocent?" I asked coldly. She hesitated, her eyes darting to the side. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe it was when I started looking forward to his messages more than yours. Or when I started making excuses to see him. It just happened. It just happened," I repeated, my voice laced with bitterness. "You didn't accidentally book a hotel room. You didn't accidentally call him babe. Don't try to make this sound like some passive mistake." Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked completely defeated. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said quietly. I need you to understand how lonely I've been. You've been so wrapped up in work, in everything else, that I felt like I didn't matter anymore." I shook my head, anger bubbling beneath the surface. "So it's my fault?" I asked, my voice rising. You're blaming this on me because I work hard to provide for us? No, she snapped, her voice cracking. I'm not blaming you. I'm just trying to explain how it got to this point. Her words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. My mind was spinning, my thoughts a chaotic mix of anger, disbelief, and hurt. Who is he? I demanded finally. Her eyes widened slightly, and she took a step back. Caleb. Who is he? I repeated, my voice steady but unrelenting. She hesitated for what felt like an eternity before finally saying his name. Ryan, she whispered. His name is Ryan. The name meant nothing to me, yet it carried the weight of everything I just lost. And where is Ryan now? I asked, my voice dripping with contempt. Sophia didn't answer, her silence telling me everything I needed to know. The truth was out, but it only raised more questions. Questions I wasn't sure I wanted the answers to. The silence in the kitchen was suffocating, each second stretching longer than the last. I stared at Sophia, her tear-streaked face a mixture of guilt and something else I couldn't quite place. Fear, maybe. My chest felt heavy, my thoughts spinning. Ryan. His name now lived in my mind, an unwanted guest tied to the unraveling of everything I thought I knew. Before I could gather my thoughts, the doorbell rang. The sound was sharp, jarring, cutting through the thick tension like a knife. Sophia froze, her eyes wide with panic. It was a subtle shift, but I caught it immediately. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She looked at the door, then back at me. I frowned, already on edge. Are you expecting someone? I asked, my tone cold. No, she said quickly, stepping forward, her voice trembling. Caleb, wait, don't. Ignoring her, I turned and walked toward the door. My hand gripped the doorknob, and I could feel her presence behind me, hovering like a shadow. When I opened the door, the man standing on the other side was the last thing I expected. Tall, mid-30s, with dark hair and a posture that oozed confidence. He was dressed casually, but everything about him screamed self-assurance. He looked me straight in the eye, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Caleb, I assume? He said, his voice smooth and measured, as if he were introducing himself at a networking event. I tightened my grip on the doorknob, my jaw clenching. Who the hell are you? I asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear him say it. He extended a hand casually, as if this were a normal encounter. I'm Ryan. Time seemed to stop. The name that had just been a faceless entity moments ago was now standing in front of me, flesh and blood, as real as the anger surging through my veins. I glanced over my shoulder at Sophia, who stood frozen a few feet behind me. Her face was pale, her expression one of sheer panic. Ryan, I repeated slowly, my voice dangerously low. I turned back to him, narrowing my eyes. And what exactly are you doing here? His smile didn't falter. I came to clear the air, he said, stepping just inside the doorway without waiting for an invitation. I figured it was about time we all got on the same page. The audacity of his words hit me like a slap. I stepped forward, my body instinctively blocking him from moving any further. Get out of my house, I said through gritted teeth. You've got 5 seconds to explain why you're here before I throw you out. Sophia's voice trembled from behind me. Ryan, you shouldn't be here, she said quickly, her tone pleading. Ryan glanced at her, then back at me, his expression smug. I think Caleb deserves to know the full story, he said, folding his arms. Don't you? I turned to Sophia, my eyes narrowing. What's he talking about? I demanded. What haven't you told me? She took a step forward, her hands outstretched as if trying to calm the situation. Caleb, please, this isn't what you think. Oh, it's exactly what he thinks, Ryan interrupted smoothly, cutting her off. Because I'm about to make it crystal clear. My patience snapped. Say what you came to say, or get the hell out, I growled, my voice sharp. Ryan raised an eyebrow, his smirk never faltering. Fine, he said, leaning casually against the doorframe. Did she tell you about the baby? The words didn't register at first. They hung in the air, heavy and out of place, like a sudden gust of wind in a quiet room. I turned to Sophia, who gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth. "Ryan!" she hissed, her voice full of panic. I stared at her, my heart pounding. "What is he talking about?" I asked, my voice shaking. "The baby?" She didn't respond, her eyes brimming with tears. Her silence was answer enough. I turned back to Ryan, who looked far too pleased with himself. "That's right," he said, his tone casual. "Sophia's pregnant. And it's mine." The world tilted beneath me. My grip on the doorframe tightened. The only thing keeping me upright as the air was sucked from my lungs. I turned back to Sophia, who was trembling, her face pale as a ghost. "Is this true?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Sophia, is he telling the truth?" She took a hesitant step toward me, tears streaming down her face. "Caleb, I was going to tell you. I didn't know how." "You didn't know how?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You thought it'd be better for me to hear it from him?" I jabbed a finger toward Ryan, who was watching the scene unfold like he was enjoying a reality show. "Caleb, I'm sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I never meant for it to go this far." "Stop saying that," I roared, slamming my hand against the doorframe. "You don't get to act like this just happened. You made these choices, Sophia. You decided to betray me." Ryan let out a low whistle, clearly enjoying the chaos he'd caused. "Well, this is getting intense. Maybe I should." "You should leave," I snapped, cutting him off. "Now." He held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. No need to get violent." He stepped back out the door, pausing just long enough to smirk at Sophia. "Call me later." Before I could stop myself, I slammed the door shut, the sound reverberating through the house. I turned to Sophia, my hands shaking. "How long?" I demanded. Her voice trembled. "What? How long have you been lying to me?" I asked, my tone ice cold. "How long has this been going on?" She looked down, her shoulders slumping. "Almost a year." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. A year. A whole year. Everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, was a lie. I didn't recognize the woman standing in front of me anymore. Without another word, I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me as her cries echoed in my ears. I walked out of the house, the crisp Portland air hitting me like a slap in the face. My chest was tight, my thoughts chaotic, as if my mind were trying to grasp the enormity of what I had just learned. Almost a year. For nearly 12 months, Sophia had been living a double life. While I'd been working late nights, grading papers, and planning moments to bring us closer together, she'd been building something else entirely, a life with him. Ryan. His smug face flashed in my mind, and my fists clenched instinctively. I couldn't believe his audacity, showing up at my house, taunting me with details of their affair. And the baby, that was the final blow, the one that left me gasping for air as though I'd been punched squarely in the stomach. I couldn't decide if I was more furious at him for saying it or at her for confirming it. My feet moved without direction, carrying me further from the house as Sophia's cries echoed faintly behind me. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Not in that house, not in that space we once called home. It didn't feel like mine anymore. It felt like a stranger's, filled with memories that now felt tainted. By the time I realized where I was standing at the edge of a park I used to run through on weekends. The place looked different in the dim light of early evening. Quiet, somber, almost as if it were mourning alongside me. I sank onto a bench, my head in my hands, and tried to piece everything together. How had it gotten this far? How had I been so blind? Every late-night excuse, every time she'd said she was working, every look of guilt I dismissed. It all came rushing back, now painted in a different light. I felt like a fool, and worse, I felt betrayed in the deepest way possible. The truth is, you don't just lose a marriage when something like this happens. You lose a part of yourself, too. The part that believed in her, the part that thought you could trust someone with everything you are. That part of me felt shattered, irreparable. After what felt like hours, I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, his voice steady but concerned. "Where are you?" he asked, and I could hear the tension in his words. "Nowhere," I said, my voice hoarse. I couldn't stay there. Come back here, he said immediately. You shouldn't be alone right now. The thought of going back to Marcus's house felt like relief and shame tangled together. Relief because I knew he'd be there to help me sort through the mess in my head. Shame because I felt like I was burdening him with something too big, too messy. I'll be there soon, I managed, hanging up before my voice cracked. I didn't trust myself to say more. By the time I arrived at Marcus's house, it was dark. He opened the door before I could knock, ushering me inside with a quiet understanding. I sank onto the couch and Max, his golden retriever, patted over, resting his head on my knee. For some reason, that small act of comfort nearly undid me. I scratched his ears absently, focusing on the softness of his fur to keep my mind from spiraling. Marcus sat across from me, his elbows resting on his knees as he waited for me to speak. I told him everything. Again. This time, though, the words felt heavier, weighed down by the realization that this wasn't just a bad dream. It was my reality now. She's been lying to me for a year, I said, my voice flat. A whole year. Marcus leaned back, his jaw tightening. Man, I don't even know what to say. That's brutal. It's more than brutal, I snapped, the anger bubbling to the surface. She had a relationship with him. She's carrying his child. And she stood there, trying to justify it, trying to blame me for it. Marcus let out a long breath. Look, I'm not going to tell you how to feel or what to do, but you can't stay in this limbo. You need to protect yourself. He was right, of course. I couldn't let this drag on. I couldn't let her explanations, her excuses, her apologies keep me trapped in a situation that was already broken beyond repair. I didn't know what my next steps were yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I was done. I stayed at Marcus's that night again, unable to face the house or Sophia's presence. When I finally lay down on the couch, staring up at the ceiling, one thought played over and over in my mind. How do you start over when everything you've built has been burned to the ground? The answer wasn't clear, but I knew I had to find it. For my own sake, I had to. The next morning, I made the decision I had been avoiding all night. Sitting at Marcus's kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee, I said it aloud for the first time. I'm going to file for divorce. Marcus nodded, his expression solemn but supportive. It's the right move, Caleb. You don't owe her anything after what she did. The words felt heavy in my mouth, but they also brought a strange sense of relief. Divorce. The end of everything I thought my marriage stood for. There was no coming back from this, no saving the trust she had shattered. It was time to start the process of untangling myself from Sophia and the mess she had created. I called a lawyer that same day. His name was Alan, a no-nonsense type who came highly recommended by a colleague. When I explained the situation to him, he listened carefully, occasionally interjecting with questions about dates, details, and proof. Proof. The word made my stomach churn. Proof of my wife's betrayal, her affair, her pregnancy. Proof of a year of lies. Do you have anything tangible? Alan asked, his voice clinical. I thought back to the call I had overheard, Ryan's smug words, and Sophia's panicked explanations. I have a recording of their conversation, I said slowly, and I've got messages on her phone. She had been careless, leaving her phone on the counter when I returned to the house the day before. I hadn't wanted to snoop, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. The messages were there, confirming everything. Plans for their weekend together. Exchanges about the pregnancy. Inside jokes I didn't understand. Good, Alan said. The more evidence we have, the easier it will be to secure a favorable settlement. I don't want anything from her, I said firmly. I just want out. Alan nodded. Understood. But even if you don't want anything, having leverage ensures she doesn't try to take anything from you. We'll make sure it's clean. The process began quickly. Alan was thorough, drafting documents and gathering evidence, while keeping me updated every step of the way. Each email and phone call from him felt like another step toward reclaiming my life. But it wasn't easy. Every signature, every meeting, every reminder of what had led me here felt like a reopening of the wound. Sophia didn't fight the divorce. When she was served with the papers, she called me once, leaving a voicemail I didn't bother listening to. The next time we spoke was through our lawyers. She agreed to everything Alan proposed: division of assets, relinquishing any claim to our home, and an acknowledgement of her infidelity. Whether it was guilt or exhaustion, I didn't know, but she didn't contest a single point. The final meeting with the lawyers was surreal. Sitting across from Sophia in a cold conference room, I barely recognized the woman I had once promised to spend my life with. She looked tired, her eyes puffy and her movements hesitant. When it was over, she lingered in the hallway as I gathered my things. I could feel her eyes on me, but I didn't turn around. "Caleb," she said softly. I paused, but I didn't look at her. "What?" "I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope someday you can find happiness." I didn't respond. Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I considered saying something, anything, but what was left to say? I walked away without looking back. The days that followed felt strangely quiet. The divorce was finalized, and with it came a sense of finality I hadn't expected. It wasn't closure, not exactly, but it was a step forward. I moved out of the house into a small apartment on the other side of town. It was modest, bare walls, minimal furniture, but it was mine. A space untainted by the memories of what I had lost. Work became my refuge. My students had no idea what I was going through, and I liked it that way. Their questions about history and their complaints about assignments gave me something to focus on. I threw myself into lesson planning and grading, filling my days with structure and purpose. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it kept me moving. Marcus checked in regularly, dragging me out of the apartment for beers or basketball games whenever he sensed I was retreating too far into myself. One night, as we sat on the patio of a local bar, he studied me carefully. "You're doing better," he said. "Better than I thought you would, honestly." "Thanks, I guess," I replied, swirling the beer in my glass. I didn't feel better, not really, but I didn't feel as raw as I had in those first days. "You're not carrying it anymore," Marcus said, leaning back in his chair. "The anger, the weight of everything she did. It's not hanging on you like it used to." His words surprised me, but as I thought about them, I realized he was right. The wounds Sophia had left were still there, but they didn't consume me anymore. They were scars now, painful, yes, but evidence of survival. Months passed, and life slowly began to take on a new rhythm. Moving into my apartment was both a relief and an adjustment. It was a modest place, nothing like the house Sophia and I had shared, but it was mine. The quiet felt jarring at first, but over time, it became a welcome escape from the noise of the past. I started filling the walls with framed photographs from trips I'd taken before we married, reminders of who I was before everything unraveled. I picked up old hobbies I'd abandoned during the marriage: photography, hiking, even cooking for myself. It wasn't easy at first. The silence in the evenings felt like a mirror, reflecting the void Sophia had left. But gradually, I found solace in the small victories: mastering a new recipe, capturing the perfect shot on a hike, reconnecting with old friends over beers and laughs. Piece by piece, I rebuilt my life. Work became my sanctuary. Teaching history provided a sense of normalcy and purpose. My students were oblivious to the turmoil I had faced, and I was grateful for it. They brought life and energy to my days, their questions about ancient wars and revolutions a welcome distraction. Marcus continued to be a steady presence in my life, checking in regularly and dragging me out of the apartment when he sensed I was retreating too far into myself. His friendship reminded me that I wasn't alone, even when it felt like the world had closed in on me. I thought I was finally settling into a new normal when an unexpected knock at my door one evening startled me. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, a woman stood there, her bright blue eyes cautious but steady. She looked to be in her early 30s, her blonde hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. "Hi," she said, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. "You don't know me, but I'm Claire, Ryan's wife." Her name hit me like a jolt, and I gripped the edge of the doorframe. Of all the people I expected to see on my doorstep, Ryan's wife was the last. My first instinct was to tell her to leave, but the vulnerability in her expression stopped me. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice harsher than I intended. She hesitated, glancing at the ground before meeting my gaze. I found out everything. About Sophia, about Ryan, about the baby. I left him. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implications I hadn't fully processed. Why are you here? I asked, my tone softening slightly. I thought you deserved to know, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion flickering in her eyes. Anne, I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything he did. For what you've been through. I blinked, stunned. Of all the things I had braced myself for after Sophia's betrayal, this wasn't one of them. I didn't know what to say. Claire continued, her tone gentle but firm. I know it doesn't fix anything, but I've been where you are. I know how lonely it feels. If you ever want to talk, she trailed off, pulling a small card from her pocket and holding it out to me. For a moment, I considered turning her away, but something in her expression, the raw vulnerability, the quiet strength, stopped me. Come in, I said, stepping aside. We sat at the small dining table, cups of coffee between us, as she shared her story. It was painfully familiar. The lies, the betrayal, the slow unraveling of trust. As she spoke, I realized we were two sides of the same coin, both caught in the wreckage of decisions we hadn't made. Talking to Claire was oddly comforting. She didn't try to offer solutions or platitudes. Instead, she listened, her empathy a balm for wounds I hadn't realized were still raw. By the time she left, I felt lighter, as if sharing our stories had lifted some of the weight I'd been carrying. Claire didn't become a permanent fixture in my life, but her visit marked a turning point. It reminded me that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about moving forward. A year later, I stood on the balcony of my apartment, watching the sun set over the Portland skyline. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine, and the city below hummed with life. For the first time in what felt like forever, I didn't feel weighed down by the past. Sophia was a distant memory now. A chapter one had closed for good. The scars of her betrayal remained, but they no longer defined me. They were a part of my story, yes, but not the whole story. I had built something new out of the wreckage, a life that was mine, shaped by my choices, my dreams. The future stretched out before me like a blank canvas, and for the first time in years, I felt ready to paint it. Whatever came next, I would face it with the strength I had found in myself. I had survived, and I was finally living again.